Welcome everyone to today's panel on staking as a service. My name is Christine Kim and I am a reporter for CoinDesk. I will be your moderator for this morning's panel. We'll be talking about an exciting new blockchain service today based on proof of stake. For those of us who don't know what proof of stake is, it is a blockchain consensus protocol where instead of miners validating transactions and creating new blocks on the network, you have validators. Validators earn interest by staking their tokens on the blockchain. And to speak more on this subject, I am joined by three very knowledgeable speakers. First, we have Head of Operations at multi-crypto staking platform Bitfish, Jen Kim, who goes by JK. Next, we have Max Murch, General Partner at crypto venture capital firm Fabric Ventures. And finally, last but not least, we are joined by the CEO of staking and lending platform Staked, Tim Ogilvy. So to start off, how was my definition of proof of stake and validators? Anything to add there about the notable features of these kinds of blockchain networks? JK?
I think how you've described it is pretty fair. But what I would add is that the definition you've given is likely to change. And what I'm trying to get at is that this entire industry, staking as a service, staking industry is just too young and so young that a lot of things I expect will change even throughout the next few months or even weeks, depending on how blockchains develop or change.
Max, would you agree with that?
Yeah, to continue on that, I think there'll be a whole bunch of networks that are focusing on the long tail of supply-side providers that will be unlocked by staking services. And so while right now a lot of the work is being that's being done is computationally heavy, we'll have very subjective work being done in the future, and there will be very specific niche cases that will be evolving in the future, and that's where I think the space is going. So there'll be this wealth of different opportunities that will arise.
Tim?
Yeah, so we see three roles in a proof of stake network that stakers can play. They stake and participate in the security of the network. They perform governance and effectively act as the central bank for determining how those proof of stake currencies perform over time, and potentially the right to perform work in those networks. So things like Filecoin or LivePeer or Augur all have a staking at the heart of them.
That's really interesting that staking has many different roles, and as a validator, you're not only securing the network, but you could also be participating in governance. Tim, could you talk a little bit about how staking as a service supports all those roles?
Sure. So we at Staked, we view our role as providing the technical layer to allow investors to figure out how do they want to participate in proof of stake networks. And so in one instance, we are an active participant in governance. We run the technical infrastructure under the hood, and we perform the work if it's a work-based staking token. In other instances, we work with investors who want to take a more active role in governance, and we are simply the pipes underneath. That might be a venture firm, it might be a crypto activist hedge fund, and we simply provide the mechanism for them to participate in staking, and are effectively invisible beyond that.
And Jen, maybe you can speak a little bit more deeply to this, but what are the comparative benefits for an individual to go through a service like Stake instead of doing it themselves? Is it higher returns? Is it an ease of using and leveraging the infrastructure that's already been put in place by a firm like Staked?
So I think the equation, just to rephrase the question a little bit, what you're really asking is if you're a token holder and you're on a proof of stake network, do you validate yourself, or do you use services like Staked or Bitfish? And it's really a simple equation. You calculate the cost of actually running the validator, and then cost the fees that you pay to service providers like us. You shouldn't overlook the value that service providers like Bitfish and Stake provides, because as Tim mentioned, we spend a lot of time doing our due diligence into these networks and trying to analyze how the change should develop in the future. And again, as I mentioned earlier, these networks are really young, and there's a lot of upgrades, governance that needs to be made that will determine the future of these chains. And we spend a lot of time discussing with these projects to help them figure out like, ooh, what upgrades are necessary, where should this chain go next, basically.
And to add to that, from the investor side, there's, well, first of all, there's certain networks, there's a certain threshold which you need to reach to be able to be a validator. So for example, in LivePeer, if you're not one of the top 25 transcoders, you can't participate. So it's a question of size. But ultimately, if you have a portfolio of, call it 10, 20, 50 investments in the space, of which, call it 50% are proof of stake based, it might become very expensive to run the infrastructure for every single one of them if you can't use economies of scale by using services such as staked and Bitfish.
And what did you think about those answers, Tim? Do you
I think
that
people should use staked. I do think it's a cost equation. I also think it comes down to just operational efficiency for investors. A lot of the investors we work with think about portfolio allocation and how to look at the sort of long-term upside, not server administration and the kind of thing we specialize in.
Well, the other thing that I wanted to yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to butt in on like the investor part actually, because I think there's a conception. I mean, there's an understanding right now. People think that staking is actually an interest-bearing like product type of type product, but let me just state that it's actually not. If you really think about it, it's basically a mechanism. You need to participate in staking in order to make sure that you don't get diluted. The network is constantly issuing new tokens under the proof of stake model. If you don't stake, you're just getting diluted essentially. So as an investor, if you want to protect your capital that how much you've invested in a single token, if you want to protect the capital in there, you need to stake. Else you're just going to get diluted.
And just to dive into why that's the case, and I think it's one of the most important parts of it, is if you think about Bitcoin, its most important use case is either transferring value or storing value, depending on how you think about it. Ethereum in its current state as well, and paying for gas. But ultimately, a lot of these staking tokens are work-based tokens, which are purely there to incentivize the supply side of the network. And so if these tokens sit in the hands of some investors or some holders who are not actually providing the supply side, those people are not helping, or if anything, they're being detrimental to the network. So what the network is trying to do is, via mechanism design, redistribute those tokens to the people and the actors who are actually participating and providing work to the network. So it's an anti-dilution for people who are being useful to the network, and it's dilution for the people who are being useless to the network.
I do want to go a little bit deeper into those comparative differences between proof of work mining and proof of stake validating. Is what you're suggesting then that because it is diluting, is the profitability for stakers, for validators, comparatively less so than for miners on proof of work? I'm asking here, in terms of the profitability of both industries, what do you see as the different dynamics that will arise as proof of stake networks become more popular?
Well, I think they're entirely separate businesses. I mean, the concept of proof of stake, you have a security budget that today is paid out in Bitcoin to Bitcoin miners. That's outside the system. It's paying a fixed rate to miners, and it then effectively becomes a cost question of if you're running a mining operation, it's entirely about your cost inputs as to how profitable you are.
Right.
Staking, in our view, is just inning one in a new set of yield creating financial products. We offer staking, we also offer lending, which was the previous panel, and those are different ways you can earn a yield on your crypto. You could also put it to work for providing liquidity to market makers. And so ultimately, we think the staking business is about who delivers the highest yield on the biggest percentage of the portfolio, and that's what we're focused on. And so I think rather than the cost business of mining, it becomes a yield and asset, effectively a asset accumulation business. That's how we think about it and kind of where we see the business going.
And if you do want to draw that parallel with looking at the costs of mining Bitcoin, I guess your fixed cost in mining Bitcoin is your ASICs, so your hardware costs, whereas your fixed cost per se in proof of stake is actually holding the volatile asset. And your variable cost in Bitcoin mining would be the electricity that you're spending, whereas in proof of stake, there is much less of a variable asset, unless you consider some of the infrastructure costs, which will be a lot lower. And so ultimately, in terms of profitability, you not only have less variable costs in proof of stake, but you also have a fixed cost, which is actually a lot more liquid, and you can trade out in and out of these fixed costs a lot easier than you can with ASICs, which have one purpose and one purpose only. And so you can rebalance into different networks, you can rebalance into different investments. So there's a lot more flexibility in that, and that is part of the profitability equation.
And as I understand, there's also a lower barrier to entry.
Definitely compared to mining operations, basically, because if you commit to a mining operations, you purchase a bunch of ASICs, you find a place to locate it, you find the cheapest electricity cost, and you set up a mining operation there. At that point, you're already pretty deep into how much capital you've sunk in there. Whereas in staking, it's for professional validators like us and staked, I'm quite sure we purchase bare metal, and so there's definitely some high cost there, but technically you could still run on cloud servers. You could be running these these validating nodes on cloud, and as we all know, using cloud, it's spinning up an instance is in the order of magnitudes much cheaper than say buying ASICs and finding a place to locate them there. So that's why I fully expect a lot more entrants to come into the validator space. But that being said, that also means that a lot of the already existing crypto platforms, I expect them to all either look to enter in the next few months or are actively looking into entering this space, because staking seems like an obvious way for all of these platforms to acquire new users.
Right.
Just recently, we saw Trust Wallet announcing they'll enable staking on their for Cosmos. You'll see these stuff in the coming months.
And that's the other thing that I wanted to ask. It's the competition that staking as a service platforms have to crypto lending platforms and crypto borrowing platforms. I mean, interest on your crypto invest as a user, you get to choose where do I invest my tokens and basically do a cost-based analysis of where do I get the most return. So what are your guys' thoughts on the competitive dynamics between staking as a service products and lending platforms or borrowing platforms? As I understand, Stake does both.
Yeah. So what we're trying to do is expose our customers to all of their options and clearly lay out yield, liquidity issues. So staking often requires a bonding period of several weeks. A loan may have a term associated with it, so your asset may not be liquid for a period of time. And any risks involved, whether those are with a counterparty on an offline lender or smart contract risk with things like Dharma or DYDX. And so we just try and lay that all out and then provide the tools to let investors make those decisions.
Do you guys have any thoughts on who would be more drawn to user-based crypto lending platforms versus stake as a service platform? What do you guys think are kind of the different target audiences, so to speak? Perhaps people who are more interested in participating in the network via governance or other roles?
So I can speak to the investor side. Apologies about that. From our perspective, when we invest into a network at the very early stages, we commit to the founders that we will be participating in their networks. And whether we do that fully in-house or we work with partners such as Stake and Bitfish, we would definitely prefer the staking route rather than the lending route. The way we think about it is that a lot of these work token models and staking token models are a bit like taxi medallions. If on day one all the taxi medallions are being held by investors and there's no drivers with taxi medallions, then the system breaks down unless the investors actually start putting in the rides. And that's sort of how we see our role as early stage investors, and that's something that we commit to doing. So we're definitely much more on the staking side. Now I do see a lot of value for retail investors to have a more managed product where they can easily shuffle from one to the other, whichever is generating more yield and almost create a sort of yield-seeking product that does jump from liquidity provision to lending to staking and jumps between the different ones as per the requirements and desires of the user.
At least from my perspective, it's not substitutes. As I mentioned, staking is not like, you shouldn't really think of it as like an yield-bearing product. I think it's really an anti-dilutionary like method. You just don't want to get diluted. So if you hold tokens where staking is enabled, like you should absolutely stake, period. It's not a consideration of, oh, whether should I lend this out or stake. It's, you should absolutely stake, or if there's a better way, like, I absolutely think it should be people should consider staking no matter what. But what I see in the future is people staking and then maybe potentially lending it out and vice versa. At this current moment, it's not possible. If something is staked, it's totally locked up. But this is one of the pain points, I think, in the staking field. I think there are projects right now actively working on trying to solve this problem. So what we'll see is all the staked tokens becoming more liquid in the future. There will be solutions for this. And once that's enabled, you could easily see people staking and then lending the tokens based on whatever they've locked up. So I see this as more of a different stack rather than like, oh, should you lend or stake?
That's a good segue to my next question, which is how do you see staking as a service evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? What services are offered now that do you think will change in the futures, and in what aspects?
So our point of view is it's going to look a whole lot like the fixed income world that exists in traditional finance today. There's a slew of products that allow investors to take a very specific point of view on a specific type of risk and approach that. And so we're building a set of tools to allow people to choose the risks they want to take and the role in governance that they want to play. And that's kind of the future we're playing out towards.
We think that if you look at the staking world now, pretty much all of the rewards are block rewards. And there's very little transaction fees or validation fees or transcoding fees on things like LifePeer. And that's just a question of time. And those will start jumping in as there's actual work being provided to these networks and people are actually starting to use the networks. For that work, there will be a dual track of revenues. On one side, you will have, you will not get diluted, and so you will receive block rewards in the native asset, but you will also receive fees for the work that you're providing in ETH or some stablecoin, or even potentially in dollars. And that sort of dual track of revenue will change the perspective of how some of these networks are evolving. You'll have some networks with high activity that will have a lot of revenues flowing to the validators and the providers of work on those networks, and so there'll be a whole economy that builds around that. And on the other side, you'll have some networks that become ghost networks, which have historically relied on block rewards, but ultimately if there's no revenue generating and no fees on it, there's no rational valuation methodology on those networks, and those will gradually have less and less participants. So that's where we see sort of this splitting of different types of networks based on their activity.
And I mean, sorry, do you have anything to add there, JK?
Just going to add about like from the validator's point of view, I think there's a lot of small and independent validators that are entering the space, thinking that validation on its own will be a very lucrative opportunity. I disagree, at least from our initial calculations. I don't think validation on its own will ever be like as lucrative as mining, I think was. I think it's wise to try to find out what other opportunities exist on top of just running validators on its own. As I mentioned before, there are definitely teams out there trying to work on, thinking about how to make all these locked up tokens liquid. These are sort of the interesting projects that I think we'll see spawning in the coming months.
But one of the things that I'm also curious about is what's to stop in the future one staking as a service firm from becoming so good at what they do that they run a good majority of the validators. I mean, because it seems to me as though the comparative barrier to entry is low and many existing crypto firms such as exchanges and crypto lending platforms could easily also kind of merge in staking as another potential service. What's to stop the centralization of one big staking as a service company?
I think you just laid the case out for it, right? It's low barrier to entry, anybody can get involved, and investors care a lot about decentralization. And so, you know, you don't have the same economies of scale as you do in mining, where if you get a highly efficient energy source and some ASICs, you win. In staking, it's really just about winning customers, and those customers care about centralization risk, and so I think it's less likely to happen.
I think the two people sitting on both sides of me here would hope that there would be such centralization and that they're on the winning side of it. But absolutely, I do think that there will be potentially a lot more participants in these new economies than there would have been in proof-of-work systems. And it's a question of framing as well, but it's also a question of mechanism design. So the framing part is, are you thinking about it as the number of people or the number of actors that are single points of failure in the system? Or are you thinking about the number of people that are benefiting in some way, shape, or form from the economy built on top of the network? If you're thinking about the latter, then obviously you have all of these different roles which are being performed in these networks, whether in proof of work you have miners and users, in proof of stake you've got delegators, validators, and users. If you move to something like Polkadot, you've got validators, fishermen, nominators, and one more which right now is sort of blanking in my mind, but you've got 4 actors, and if you move into things like LivePeer, you've got transcoders, you've got delegators, you've got users who are actually ranking the validators with their stake, and actually users who are using the video. And so you have all of these different actors which are coming into play in these networks, and that will largely expand the number of participants in these networks. Compared to proof of work, where you have indeed this very high level of concentration and economies of scale around hardware production and electricity costs.
Number one, if a good validator is good, and that's the reason why they have like, you know, a huge network power, great. You know, you definitely want good validators on top of that list. But second, the switching cost of changing your validators, you know, is nil. Like, it's just a flick of a button. Like, even if you stake with us right now, you could just switch to staked just with a click of a button. It's so easy, meaning that we're like, we need to try, we're doing our best to make sure that we're always on top of the line, we're always communicative, we always have the best security, and we will, like, despite having so much network power right now on Cosmos, we're right now like sitting at number 3, like, we don't feel like we can do like, we don't ever feel at any point that we can act maliciously or even like, you know, become ever lazy at all. Like, because again, if we don't act in our best interest of our delegators, they could easily switch away from us. So despite having a large network power, for us, it doesn't, like, it's still day one for us. It's the same, we feel the same way as if we had only 1% of the network, because the delegators could easily leave us.
And to add a point in terms of mechanism design from the projects or from the network's perspective, there are networks that are starting to think about higher slashing conditions for larger pools. So that's one way to make sure that there's no pool that's too big to fail effectively, and that you have a certain cap above which it's not great to be part of that pool anymore. Or you have others such as Tezos, which put up a certain bond that or enforce a certain bond that needs to be put up by the validators. I believe it's 7, they can only validate for 7x their own bond, above which they don't get the rewards for it. And so it becomes extremely expensive to become that big of a validator again.
Well, I think we're actually out of time now, but as a very final question for each of you, I wanted to bring it back down to some of the specifics like the mechanism design. What is one proof of stake, 1 or 2 proof of stake blockchain networks that you are intrigued, what aspects, actually no, what proof of stake blockchain network are you guys intrigued by that has either already launched or is about to launch, and why?
I mean, I could start off, and I'll say straight away that, like, I'm pretty keen on seeing Casper, you know, Ethereum 2.0 launching, just primarily because most of the mechanism designs we see so far have somewhat of a limited validator set, and we'd be curious to see how the economics of all this changes once anyone, even the retail holders could easily spin up a block producing node.
On my side, I'm pretty excited about Keep Network, which is going to be launching soon. And as a disclaimer, we are investors. But they have a very classic work token, which from a valuation perspective and a value accrual perspective makes a lot of sense, but also have a very strong incentive mechanism design behind it. And they've worked pretty hard on building their first application on top of the network, which will actually bring traction in terms of fees to the networks, which is something that we haven't seen so much so far in any of these proof-of-stake mechanisms. So seeing how that plays out and how the sort of dual revenue streams between fees and block rewards will play out will be really interesting.
I'm really interested in Cosmos and Polkadot. I think the interoperability that they open up is going to really open the design space in terms of DeFi applications and what people can do with their crypto assets.
Well, thank you, JK, Max, and Tim for your time, and thank you to our audience for listening to this panel.